Hi, it is JIT UA Courses, and welcome to lesson number 19 of the .NET Developer series, in which we will cover the most relevant topics to becoming a .NET developer. So hit the subscribe button and bell to see new videos on our channel. Okay, let's go. In this lesson, we will learn about middleware, web application configuration, and controllers. If this sounds interesting to you, don't hesitate and hit the like button. What is middleware? One of the main tasks of the program is the processing of incoming requests. ASP.NET Core request processing is organized according to the principle of a conveyor, which consists of components. Such components are also called middleware. When a request is received, the first component of the pipeline receives the request data first. After processing the request, the middleware component can finish processing the request. Such a component is also called a terminal component, terminal middleware. Or it can pass the request data for processing further down the pipeline, to the next component in the pipeline, and so on. After the request is processed by the last component, the request data is returned to the previous component. It can be shown schematically as follows. Middleware components are embedded using the run, map, and use extension methods of the iApplication Builder interface. The web application class implements this interface and therefore allows you to add middleware components using these methods. Each middleware component can be defined as a method, built-in inline component, or can be assigned to a separate class. When receiving a request, the server creates an HTTP context object based on it, which contains all the necessary information about the request. This information is passed to all middleware components in the application using the HTTP context object. Built-in middleware components. It is worth noting that ASP.NET Core already provides several built-in middleware components for common tasks by default. Authentication provides authentication support. Authorization provides authorization support. Cookie policy monitors the user's consent to store related information in cookies. SURES. Health check checks the health of the ASP.NET Core application. HTTP logging logs information about incoming requests and generated responses. HTTPS redirection redirects all HTTP requests to HTTPS. MVC provides the functionality of the MVC framework. Response caching allows caching of query results. Endpoint routing provides a routing mechanism. Session provides support for sessions. SPA handles all requests, returning the default page for a SPA, single-page application. Static files provide support for handling static files. WebSockets add support for the WebSockets protocol. Extension methods of a type that begins with use are defined for the iApplication Builder interface to embed these components in the request processing pipeline. For example, the ASP.NET Core framework by default provides a middleware like Welcome Page middleware that sends some standard web page to the client. The useWelcomePage extension method is used to connect this component to the request pipeline. And when executing this program, the browser will present to our eyes the following picturesque page. Use and run. The easiest way to add middleware to the request processing pipeline in ASP.NET Core is through the run method. The run method adds a terminal component, a component that completes request processing. Therefore, accordingly, it does not call any other components and further processing of the request, it does not pass it on to the next components in the pipeline. Therefore, this method should be called at the end of the construction of the request processing pipeline. Other methods that add middleware components can be placed before it. We use this method to determine the simplest component. A few remarks should be made here. First of all, do not confuse the run method, which is defined in the web application class and which starts the application, and the run extension method, which embeds the middleware component. These are two different methods that perform different tasks. As you can see from the code above, both of these methods are called. The second point is that the run method, which starts the program, is called after adding the middleware component. Use. The use extension method adds a middleware component that allows the processing of a request to be passed on to subsequent components in the pipeline. In general, the use of the use method looks like this. The work of middleware is divided into two parts. Middleware performs some initial request processing before calling await next.invoke. The next.invoke method is then called, which passes the processing of the request to the next component in the pipeline. When the next component in the pipeline has finished processing, the request is returned to the current component, and the actions that follow await next.invoke are performed. Thus, the middleware in the use method performs actions before and after the next component in the pipeline. Middleware in the use method does not necessarily have to call the next component in the pipeline. Instead, it can complete the processing of the request. In this case, it can act as the same terminal middleware component, as well as components of the run method. Configuration. An important role of the program is played by the configuration, which determines the basic settings of the program. An ASP.NET Core application can obtain configuration settings from the following sources. Command line arguments. Environmental variables. .NET objects in memory. File, JSON, XML, INI. Azure. You can use your custom sources and create configuration providers under them. Getting configuration data. In the settings, the configuration is stored in the configuration property of the web application object. Accordingly, through this property, we can set or get configuration settings. Configuration in JSON. As a rule, JSON files are used to store the configuration in ASP.NET Core. The JSON configuration provider is used to work with JSON files, and the add JSON file extension method is used to load the configuration from JSON. By default, the project already has a JSON configuration file, Appsettings JSON, as well as Appsettings development JSON, which are loaded by default in the application and which we can use to save configuration settings. For example, the code in the Appsettings JSON file. Logging settings, logging element, and allowed hosts element, are defined here. Single elements can have nested elements. Similarly, you can set other necessary settings or delete previously defined ones. However, in this case, let's take a new JSON file as an example. So, let's add a new config.json file to the project. And we define the following content in it. Two elements with the keys, person, and company, are specified here. We use these settings in the application. To set the configuration from a JSON file, the file name is passed to the addJSONFile method. When defining the settings in the JSON file, it should be taken into account that they must have unique keys. But at the same time, we can use more than one file for configuration. If the second file has settings that have the same key as the settings of the first file, then the settings are overridden. The settings of the second file replace the settings of the first. But JSON can also store more complex objects. Controller. The ASP.NET Core framework allows us to significantly simplify the processing of each request using the library's built-in MVC functionality. We can simply add it to our application with the help of special middleware that will add you or other capabilities to the request processing. The functionality of MVC and its operation in the application depends on the added services. Add MVC adds all services of the MVC framework, including services for working with authentication and authorization, validation, etc. Add MVC Core adds only the main services of the MVC framework, and all additional functionality, such as authentication and authorization, validation, etc., must be added independently. Add controllers with views adds only those MVC framework services that allow the use of controllers and views and related functionality. When creating a project of the web application, model view controller type, this method is used. Add controllers allows you to use controllers but without views. Web API is a way of building an ASP.NET application, which is specially sharpened to work in the REST, representation state transfer, style. The REST architecture involves using the following methods or types of HTTP requests to interact with the server: GET, POST, PUT, DELETE. Most often, the REST style is especially convenient when creating various single-page applications, which often use special JavaScript frameworks such as Angular, React, or Vue.js. A web API is essentially a web service that can be accessed by other applications. These programs can represent any technology and platform. They can be web applications or mobile or desktop clients. MVC controllers are responsible for responding to requests made to an ASP.NET MVC website. Each browser request is processed by a specific controller. For example, imagine you type the following URL into your browser's address bar. In this case, a controller named Product Controller is called. The Product Controller is responsible for generating a response to a browser request. For example, a controller can return a certain view to the browser, or a controller can redirect the user to another controller. Action, the method that processes the request to the controller, of the controller must be an open method of the controller class. C# methods are private by default. Understand that any public method you add to a controller class is automatically exposed as a controller action. You have to be careful about this because a controller action can be called by anyone in the universe just by typing the correct URL into the browser's address bar. There are some additional requirements that the controller action must satisfy. A method used as a controller action cannot be overloaded. Also, a controller action cannot be a static method. Additionally, you can use almost any method as a controller action. Next, add a new controllers folder to the project, and create a new API controller in it. To do this, when adding a new element to the project, you can use the API controller class template. Let's create the new element users controller. First of all, the API controller attribute is applied to the controller, which allows you to use many additional features, in particular, in terms of model binding and others. A routing attribute is also applied to the controller, which indicates how the controller will be mapped to requests. In the constructor of the controller, we get the data context and use it for data operations. The API controller is primarily intended for processing requests of the HTTP protocol: GET, POST, PUT, DELETE, PATCH, HEAD, options. In this case, each type of request has its methods defined in the controller. Yes, the GET method handles GET requests and returns a collection of objects from the database. If the GET request contains an ID parameter, object identifier, it is processed by another method, GET int ID, which returns the object by the past ID. POST type requests are processed by the POST user method, which receives the sent data from the request body and adds it to the database. The PUT method, user processes PUT type requests, receives data from the request and changes the object in the database with them. The delete int ID method processes delete type requests, that is, deletion requests. It receives the ID parameter from the request and deletes the object from the database with this identifier. This is all for this lesson. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so as not to miss the following videos in the series. Feel free to leave a comment and like this video. You are also welcome to leave any questions in the comments section. I will be happy to answer them. And also I encourage you to help brave people in Ukraine to defend themselves in this horrible war. Please use the QR code or links in the description to visit charitable foundations that help Ukraine. Thanks. See you in the next videos.